I don't know where the idea came from that I should come and be the one to talk about Bob Wiatt, but the invitation to do so was and is immensely flattering. I'm humbled and I'm honored to talk about this great man, and I most sincerely do mean this great man. Bob Wiatt, Susan, was the true Renaissance man. Here's the formal definition of a Renaissance man from Noah Webster's successors. Quote, one skilled in multiple fields of disciplines, unquote. Most sources like Webster, when defining the Renaissance man, show you a picture of Leonardo da Vinci, not Bill Harper. But in my dictionary at home, when I call up the word Renaissance man, it shows that guy, Bob Wiatt. My dictionary shows Bob Wiatt, and Bob Wiatt is a man who could do it all. And in many, many instances, his job was a heck of a lot harder than Leonardo da Vinci's. Starting with the basics, Bob was a good son and a brother. He was a determined suitor and a loving husband. He was a stern but understanding father. As a grandfather, he was a year-round Santa Claus. He was the epitome of what a law enforcement officer should be. He was an innovating assistant district attorney, and he was the creative mentoring builder of Texas A&M's Department of Security and University Police. Robert E. Wiatt was born on August 10, 1926, the year that Ernest Hemingway wrote The Sun Also Rises. 1926 was the year that the National Broadcasting System was born. Featuring on the 1926 broadcast for NBC was Amos and Andy and a whole bunch of soap operas. 1926 was the year that Rin Tin Tin came to the silver screen, and he was out drawing such as Charlie Chaplin, William S. Hart, and Tom Mix and his wonder horse Tony. So there in 1926, we have NBC, Rin Tin Tin, and Bob Wiatt. Together, they made 1926 a monument to glory in the pantheon of time. Bob was born in a town that I'll bet nobody in this room can recognize other than Ann Wiatt and me, and that was Washington Courthouse, Ohio. Anybody been there? All right, whoa, look at this. It's a big booming metropolis. It's 70 miles north of Cincinnati, and all you people have been there. His dad was a World War I veteran, and he moved from that booming metropolis of Washington Courthouse to Cincinnati shortly after Bob's birth. And there is no truth to the rumor that he had to get out of town for bringing Bob into this world. Bob went into the Navy in 1944, right after high school in Cincinnati. He was 17 at the time, and he served 2 years in the Navy until the summer of 1946. He was initially assigned as one of 11 Navy guys on a Liberty ship, a Liberty cargo ship, that was also an ammunition carrier. He was supposed to make the Murmansk Run. Now that's the Murmansk Run where you go up over Scotland and Sweden and Norway and Finland, and you come into Russia bringing supplies for the Russian armies during World War II. My brother was in the U.S. Merchant Marine in 1942, and he made a Murmansk Run. In his convoy, there were 22 ships. 4 of them made it to Murmansk. 18 of them made it to the bottom of the ocean by the German U-boats. Kind of chokes you up a little bit. Bob Wiatt, though, he lucked out, and his convoy was diverted to the Panama Canal, where he served as a signalman in the Navy. He was doing that flashing of the light business, and he was waving the flags as those Navy signalmen do. And he ultimately saw action in the Battle of Okinawa, which in accordance with Bob's sense of humor, started on April Fool's Day, 1945. So now instead of dodging German U-boats, the biggest thing Bob had to worry about at Okinawa was Japanese kamikaze planes. And as Bob so nonchalantly told me, they were still occasionally coming. Bob just smiled a bit when I told him it only takes one occasionally to be there. Bemedaled and once wounded, he was honorably discharged from the Navy in July of 1946. He then went immediately back to Cincinnati and enrolled in the University of Cincinnati under the GI Bill. There he played offensive tackle and defensive end for the football team, and his coach was the NFL legend, former Hall of Famer Sid Gilman, who would later coach the Houston Oilers. Bob got his BA degree in 3 years. No fooling around with that guy. Next, he went to Chase Law School in Cincinnati and got a law degree by going to a lot of night classes, working part-time selling insurance, writing articles for the company magazine, and as he put it, doing a few other things. Imagine that, going to law school, selling insurance, writing for a magazine, and doing a few other things. There he is again, loafing through life. Bob got his law degree in 1951 and directly applied for the Bureau. All those guys talk that way about the Bureau. It's ominous, it's the Bureau. Woo. When I first heard that, I didn't know whether Bob was talking about the Federal Bureau of Investigation or the Missing Persons Bureau. He let me know in a hurry which one it was. Again, however, Bob's luck, and you know that luck is the byproduct of hard work, Bob's luck held out. 10 recruits applied for training with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. Only one of those 10 made it. Anybody want to guess the name of that one? Wonderful. Bob was immediately assigned to training at FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., and Bob spent 30-some years with the Bureau. And as we all know, and as we'll hear about shortly, he was involved in some pretty notorious situations during those years. But rookie special agent Robert E. Wiatt made the biggest catch of his life right there in FBI headquarters as a raw recruit. Bob's initial training was taking place on the 3rd floor of the Justice Department building. Now, all the recruits at that time, and maybe for the entire 50 years, would always find a reason to go up to the 5th floor of the Justice Department building because that's where J. Edgar Hoover's office was. And everybody wanted to see J. Edgar Hoover. Bob went up to the 5th floor. He didn't want to see J. Edgar Hoover. There was a secretary down the hall from J. Edgar Hoover's office. She had a sign on her desk that said, Ann Cobb. Okay. He was there, she was there, and there's the guy that they were all looking for. There's the girl he was looking for. And that's what happened. The way Bob told it to me, he was kind of attracted to her. Her name was, as I said, Ann Cobb. Now it's Ann Wiatt. I say right here and now, if it wasn't for Ann Wiatt and the multitude of contributions of time and talent that she has made to many, many organizations in our vicinity, from the Community Foundation of Brazos Valley to the Brazos Valley Symphony Orchestra and much more, this area would just be another small dot on the map of Texas. Bob and Ann were married in 1953 in New York City and went on to have 2 sons, Scott and Jeff. So that's how Bob made the biggest catch of his life, right there under the nose of the biggest G-man of all, J. Edgar Hoover, in the Justice Department building in Washington, D.C. Although he was married in the Big Apple and stationed there, he said, "I wouldn't want to raise a family there." I hope Mayor Bloomberg of New York City is not in the audience, but that's the way he felt. So Bob volunteered to get out of the Big Apple and go to Puerto Rico. Now there's his choice. Trade New York City for Puerto Rico. The reason Bob was needed in Puerto Rico was that the Nationalist Party there was rising in its opposition to the island being a territory of the United States. The Nationalists said they were going to start killing Yankees in order to get independence for that island. This was the same group that in 1950 tried to kill President Harry S. Truman when they attacked the Blair House in Washington, D.C. In January of 1954, 4 of these people burst into the U.S. House of Representatives, shot the place up, and hit 5 representatives. Right after that, according to Bob, the FBI went to arrest the nationalist leader. Long story short, Bob said, "We went there early that morning, told them all to come on out. They fired at us, and we spent half the day going around the buildings firing and ducking. Thousands of rounds were fired. Nobody was hurt at all. Finally, they came out and surrendered." Unquote. Bingo, just like that. Just another day at the office for Bob Wiatt. And only a few thousand rounds of ammunition were shot in his direction. It was his first test under fire as an FBI agent. It surely wouldn't be his last. But Bob and Ann stayed down there for 4 years, and they came back stateside and were stationed in Flagstaff, Arizona, and were transferred eventually to Houston. And then, Bob said, "I was put up here in Bryan College Station in late 1958 in charge of the Bryan office. So I've been here ever since," and indeed he has. Bob felt that we were in a good place. We were very much enamored with this local area, and we liked the work, the people, and so we stayed. We had several opportunities to move up and out. In fact, if you are offered a promotion in the FBI and turn it down, it's like the kiss of death, he said. I didn't want to move to D.C. and headquarters because then you're in and out, going around to other offices, checking things out, doing a lot of mundane traveling, moving here, moving there. I said, no, I don't want to be a desk man. So I stayed here, and they never moved me, he told me. And the citizens of Bryan, Texas, and College Station, Texas, and Brazos Valley, and this whole state of Texas and the United States of America were the beneficiaries of Wiatt's work in law enforcement. Our current Brazos County District Attorney, Bill Turner, said, I've heard that a lot of the FBI agents and their local law enforcement counterparts in this part of the country don't get along too well. One of the reasons is that some of the locals feel like the feds are trying to take over. Turner said that was never the case here. And just about everyone involved gave complete credit for that harmony to Bob Wiatt. That's because Bob Wiatt was somebody that everyone had total trust in and confidence in. Even after he retired from FBI, whenever the Bureau needed something in Brazos County, it always came to Bob. That's what Turner said. Let me tell you, folks, I've talked with a number of people who knew Bob with the Bureau, and people who just flat out knew him as a citizen of the area. And they're consistent in their opinion that had Bob gone on to take that desk job in Washington, D.C., he would have ended up in J. Edgar Hoover's office. And I don't doubt that for one little minute. Speaking of Hoover and his successors in that chair, every one of them through William Webster, 1978, 1987, every one of them commended Bob on numerous occasions for his 30 years of outstanding service to the Bureau and to the country. Everyone, from princes to the paupers, figuratively speaking, for the latter, had words of praise for Bob Wiatt. At the time of Bob's retirement as top cop at Texas A&M, our current Secretary of Defense and then Aggie President Robert M. Gates said, I want to thank Bob for his selfless dedication to this university. His vast experience in law enforcement and his leadership in his department have been instrumental in creating a top-notch law enforcement team and a safe environment for all of us on this campus. His experience and effectiveness, as well as his humor, will be greatly missed. As we can see from the screen, Bob was also received commendations from former U.S. President Bill Clinton. Texas Governor Rick Perry weighed in when he called Wiatt a man whose life is a profile of courage and integrity. Perhaps the best summary of Wiatt's half-century in law enforcement was presented personally by Ray M. Bowen, another past president of Texas A&M, who observed, "Bob was never reluctant to put himself in harm's way." Aggie President Ray Bowen and the Police Department Director Bob Wiatt shared personal triumphs and tragedies, but none so devastating as the bonfire collapse on November 18, 1999. Bob Wiatt has had some dark days in his life, and perhaps only one surpasses that November date. To the end of his days, he never did get over it, and the fact that he was one who had to call a number of the families of those killed in that tragedy and give them the bad news. Imagine if you had to do that. As we mentioned a moment ago, at the end of the socio-economic professional scale, and I know he'll forgive me for placing him there, were the likes of Alan Barone, currently a sergeant on the Aggie Police Force. "We called him Director Wiatt," said Barone, evoking to this day an aura of respect. "All I heard when I first started as an 18-year-old parking officer were stories about Director Wiatt and what a legend he was." Barone continued, "He had a presence when you walked into the room. He was so interesting to talk to because he was one of the last of a dying breed, those guys who served in World War II and went through the tough times of social change in the 50s and the 60s, times that we look upon as history. He was always so supportive," said Barone, "to all of us young guys to get an education and to succeed and progress. He was always concerned about young folks doing the right thing. He definitely provided the building blocks and the foundation for where the police department at A&M is today." However, if you want to meet a man who loves kids, meet a man who's lost one. Bob and Ann lost one. The oldest of their two sons, 18-year-old Scott, died a lingering death from Hodgkin's disease in 1976, and we all mourn. Alan Barone was only 18 also, hardly more than a kid when he first met Bob Wiatt. It didn't take long for the director to help this kid up the ladder of success and progress in the field of community service. When Bob left the bad guy world of the FBI and came to the quiet confines of Texas A&M, he ran into somewhat of a culture shock. After Huntsville, Sugar Land, the docks of New York City, and assorted and sundry other threats to life and limb, about which we'll hear more, how was he ever going to deal with the magnitude of problems that he had on the campus of Texas A&M? DA Bill Turner told me about one of Bob's early days on the campus. An elderly matron approached Bob while Bob was on duty at an Aggie football game at Kyle Field. She started protesting vigorously about the man sitting next to her who was smoking a cigarette and the smoke was blowing in her direction. It was annoying her worse than the opposition's touchdowns against the Aggies. Of course, this was back in the days when smoking was legal in Kyle Field and almost everywhere else. Always the courteous gentleman, Bob listened intently as the woman's wrath wore on, and she complained about what a vile and dirty habit smoking was. Bob, in his understanding manner, agreed with her about that horrible habit. The harried woman pleaded, would he, the campus chief of police, please do something about it? In a tender and understanding way, Bob assured the poor woman that he would see that something would indeed be done. he directed one of his officers to personally escort the woman to Bob's bird's eye seat up in the press box for what was left in the game. It was only after the woman left that Bob jerked his left hand from behind his back, the left hand that was holding a smoldering cigarette that was starting to burn his fingertips. Whether it was placating Aggie moms, helping kids up the ladder of success, or tracking down and fighting killers, Bob Wiatt set the bar. And what an outstanding term of service his was. It was a service that creates legends, and Bob was all of that, a legendary lawman. Let me rattle off just a few of his more notable exploits. Within hours of that fateful afternoon at Dealey Plaza in Dallas on November 22nd, 1963, Special Agent Robert E. Wiatt was dispatched from his Bryan office to that city to become part of a massive team investigating the crime of the century. It was another case in which he was involved, but which he wasn't supposed to be there. At that time, if you can believe this, the assassination of an American president was not a federal offense. The murder of John F. Kennedy at Dealey Plaza in 1963 was billed as a local crime. And the FBI only works on federal crimes. The FBI supposedly had no jurisdiction in local crimes. But that was not the only time that Bob was involved in a case in which he had no business being there. It was the same way in Huntsville in 1974. In 1964, Bob went to work on the murder of 3 civil rights workers in Philadelphia, Mississippi, more commonly known as the Mississippi Burning. It was an old-fashioned lynching carried out with the help of county officials. It came to symbolize hardcore resistance to racial integration. An intense FBI investigation led to the discoveries of the bodies of the murdered victims and the identities of the killers. Bob Wiatt was there when they uncovered the murder car. In 1950, as Bob put it, we went undercover in New York on the docks. We were after some guy named Thomas Lucchese, also known as Three Finger Brown. And we made a little bit of news, Bob said, unquote. What Bob didn't say was that Lucchese palled around with the likes of Charles Lucky Luciano, and another pal of Lucchese's was Frank Costello. At one time, Lucchese was expected to be Costello's successor as head of the biggest mafia ring in the United States. Bob Wiatt's undercover work on the docks of New York City did indeed make a little bit of news. It helped send Thomas Three Finger Lucchese to Alcatraz, but Bob didn't tell me that. Then too, Special Agent Bob Wiatt was involved in the final appeal process for Julius and Ethel Rosenberg. As you all know and remember, Julius and Ethel Rosenberg were tried and convicted and sentenced to death for espionage and giving the Russians atomic bomb secrets in 1953. Bob has been there and he has done that. And the absence of ostentation or showiness on his part is historic. The very first time I asked him about his role in the hostage taking at Huntsville in 1974, he answered me like this, quote, "I was there at the Walls unit on that particular day interviewing an inmate for a civil rights complaint. At about 1 o'clock on that Wednesday afternoon, as I was getting into my car to come back to Bryan, a prison official came running out the front door. He was hollering, 'Bob, get your gun, get in here right away. Some convicts have taken some hostages in the prison library.' So I grabbed my gun, went back into the prison, and I didn't come out for 11 and a half days, unquote." That's it from Bob. Nothing more. He didn't say how he was one of the prime movers in ending the siege. He didn't mention being hit twice with bullets from Fred Carrasco's .357 Magnum pistol. He didn't mention all the other factors he was responsible for, such as the training of the SWAT teams that would be needed if authorities had to charge the library where the hostages were being held. Quote, I went back into the prison, and I didn't come out for 11 and a half days. The Huntsville siege was the only time Bob was ever shot. How's that for a job description? I was only shot once. Bob did mention, however, that I've been stabbed with a knife. I've been hit with a sickle by a woman in Rome, Georgia, when I tried to arrest her son. I've been kicked and beaten a few times. The stabbing occurred when he tried to arrest another guy in Georgia. That resulted in a slight, he told me, slash across his chest. But that, said Bob with a grin, wasn't as bad as the woman with the sickle. It went into my side, but not too far. She was seriously out to get me, Bob told me. 5'5" and about 190 pounds, she had arms bigger than legs. And her 16-year-old daughter was the same way. They both jumped me when I went into the house to arrest her son. All three ended up in the courthouse. Speaking of my talks with Bob when I was writing on the 11 Days in Hell book, he and I would drive over to Huntsville for follow-up work and interviews. It's 50 miles from here to Huntsville, 50 miles back. With Bob riding shotgun in the car, was 50 stories over, 50 stories back. What a career. As I said, he was part of FBI's first SWAT team. That's Special Weapons and Tactics. He was part of the FBI's initial hostage negotiation training cadre. Both of these tactics that Bob was specialized in were employed by Bob during the Huntsville siege. That's Bob sitting there in the lower left-hand corner of that picture with Jim Estelle, the director of the Texas Department of Corrections, on the phone negotiating with Carrasco. As Bob told it, when the Walls unit siege taking made national news on the second day, the Bureau decided there was no federal crime involved and this was going to be a bad scene, and Bob said this, get the hell out. The FBI wanted no part of the FBI agent being there. The bad guys were demanding their freedom. They had guns, they had ammunition, and it was going to be, as everybody knew, a bad scene. At that point, said Bob, TDC Director Jim Estelle and Texas Governor Dolph Briscoe made phone calls back to Washington saying, look, Wiatt knows our people and they know him and they trust him. He has some particular knowledge that we think we can use, SWAT, hostage negotiations, etc. So can we keep him? Washington relented just a bit and said Bob could stay, but, quote, only as an observer. He's not to get involved in any decision making. Got it? So Bob became an official observer. Can you imagine Bob Wiatt as an observer? But he complied as an observer and kept giving Houston and Washington regular reports. But he was a huge part of the think tank of senior officers. Estelle put him in charge of the assault teams, and there was a constant training program for police officers from across the state. He was also involved with 4 or 5 other senior officers in every decision made in the think tank. Washington never did know that Bob was involved to that degree until the very last day when the bloody shootout occurred. By then, national TV was all over the place with live coverage, breaking news coverage. That forced Bob to call his Houston office and tell what happened. Here's how he put it. You're going to hear a little bit about this in a while, and I got a little involved. Basically, I was shot twice, but I had my bulletproof vest on, so I'm okay, unquote. The agent receiving the call, in Bob's words, went ballistic. He practically screamed back at Bob that he had disobeyed orders and he was going to have him fired. Well, with a little help from a lot of friends, Washington heard of Bob's tactical contributions and his heroics, and it backed down. Bob was off the hook. Bob Wiatt, like many lawmen I've known during my career as a newspaperman and a writer of sorts, was justifiably suspect, to say the least, of the veracity of the media. And here's one reason why. In an internet service story, it was reported that, quote, the Sugarland Express movie script was a true story written by Robert Wiatt. The famed FBI agent not only experienced this event, but also is credited with killing Fred Gomez Carrasco in July 1974, the undisputed head of the Texas Mexican Mafia, unquote. That story appeared just a month and a half ago. I'm truly sorry it didn't appear a year and a half ago so Bob and I could have sat down and had a huge laugh about it. Bob never wrote the script for that film or any other film. He was, of course, consulted when they made the film Sugarland Express, and then his consultations were totally ignored and typically ignored by film director Steven Spielberg and his movie makers. Despite what the news service said, Bob Wiatt did not kill Fred Carrasco. Bob Wiatt did kill Rudy Dominguez. Bob Wiatt did take 357 bullets, 2 of them, to his chest, and it knocked him briefly unconscious, but he was saved by that bulletproof vest. He did kill, or helped to kill, Rudy Dominguez because Rudy Dominguez was drawing a bead on Bob and another officer, and it was shoot first or die. Bob wasn't ready to die, and he was pretty quick with the trigger. So instead of getting the kudos that he should have gotten for that heroic event in that prison uprising, he and the other officer, DPS officer Winston Pageant, were vilified in some of the media for murdering poor little defenseless Rudy Dominguez, who at the very instant was trying to shoot the officers. Some branches of the ACLU had a field day with that bunch of baloney, and some branches of the media went right along with them. However, Bert Graham, veteran prosecutor in the Huntsville Walls prison shootout case, summarized his feeling about the man we honor today. Mr. Graham said, Bob Wiatt was a man of uncommon valor. Hostage negotiations also figures in his story of the kidnapping in Burleson County. Back in 1968, he told me, I was in the sheriff's office, and we heard that Donald Hammond of Seabrook, Texas, killed his wife in Houston. 2 police officers responded. Hammond managed to take their guns, put them in a closet, and steal a truck. The highway patrol up here notified, we have spotted the car and we're in contact over here at a rural school in Cooks Point in Burleson County. The bad guy bailed out of his car and ran into a school cafeteria where the kids were having lunch. Officers went in after him. When they got there, he had a gun up against the head of a 16-year-old schoolgirl. He dragged that little girl into the principal's office and took the principal hostage too. The standoff had been going on for several hours, with the perp firing at least 1 shot at the police officers. When the sheriff and I got there, Bob recalled, there must have been 50 to 75 officers all around the place. A Texas Ranger who had been negotiating with Hammond told me the kidnapper would only talk to an FBI agent. So, Bob related, I went into the principal's office and the first thing Hammond said was, take off your clothes. Huh? So he had me stripped down to my shorts to see that I had no gun. I must digress for a moment in this narration to tell you that the Houston Chronicle ran a headline on that incident that said, FBI agent bears all to capture killer. Back to the story, and after doing his striptease act, Bob negotiated himself in exchange for the 2 hostages. Allowed to put his clothes back on, the negotiations went on for about 3 or 4 hours. Long story short, said Bob, I talked the guy into surrendering, and that was it. Long story short, that was it. The man's modesty, lack of braggadocio, absence of pretentiousness is sometimes, for a storyteller like me, overwhelming. I would almost scream at him, come on, Bob, there's got to be more. That was it. Bob was lucky with Hammond, but he wasn't always that lucky in hostage negotiations. He told me another story about the time he was called in for a suicide attempt. As he said it, they called me down for a bank robber in Houston. The agents went to get him in his house, and he ran into the bathroom. He was in the bathtub with a gun in his mouth. They tried to talk to him, but to no avail. So they called me, and I, with all my crisis negotiation training and skills, go into the bathroom to try and establish some rapport. Almost sashaying in like a vacuum cleaner salesman, I talk real friendly. Excuse me, I'm Bob Wiatt. I'm from the FBI, and I'm here to help you. Boom! The guy pulls the trigger. Case closed. Bob's fellow agent said, thanks, Bob. That's one we don't have to take to trial. What a guy. In a far darker turn of events and negotiation situation, Bob was also involved in the lengthy talks agents were having with David Koresh during the Branch Davidian tragedy near Waco in 1993. Even though he had left the Bureau in 1990, the FBI put him back on temporary active duty and used him as a principal hostage negotiations advisor for the FBI office in Houston. In other words, when Koresh said this, FBI wanted to know from Bob what he meant by that. The tragic and flaming end to the Branch Davidia thing came as a shock to Bob. He never said so to me, but there are those who, in retrospect, felt the negotiations on site with the good guys didn't talk long enough. But that's a judgment call. Timing, as we're told, is everything. Bob Wiatt's timing was amazing. We know how he just happened to be at Huntsville on that July 24th day in 1974. How he just happened to be sitting in the sheriff's office when the radio screeched the start of the Burleson County schoolgirl kidnapping story in 1968. We know how he and another officer were on the A&M campus in 1969 when another officer just happened to hear the start of the Sugar Land Express chase and brought Bob into it. But Bob also lucked out many times in his life. On the Murmansk run, on the 5th floor of the FBI headquarters in Washington, D.C., where he found Ann, the light of his amazing life. And at the Walls unit in Huntsville, et cetera, et cetera. As we've said here, luck is the byproduct of preparation. As Bob's FBI career was coming to an end, he lucked out again. In December of 1980, Bob was facing FBI's mandatory retirement rule, and it was mandatory. As Bob put it, they would kick you out the door. But he continued, the county district attorney here at that time, Travis Bryan, offered me a job starting in January as a special intake attorney. That's one who determines whether a case is worthy of prosecution, and as an investigator. So just like that, before he could be kicked out the door, he retired from the FBI around Christmas time in 1980. He went to work the first week of January in the Brazos County District Attorney's office, and he stayed there until February 1st, 1983, when he came to Texas A&M. Yet even in his brief stay in the DA's office in Bryan, Bob continued to make substantial contributions to the world of law enforcement. Bill Turner, our present-day Brazos County District Attorney, told me about one of the biggest. As Bill put it, it was just the power of his personality that got us through a lot of hard times, such as with the Rape Crisis Center. At the time it started, Bob taught the staff the mind of the sex offender, which enabled the staff to in turn teach vulnerable targets. Bob Wiatt, Bill Turner continued, was the motivation that got law enforcement behind that organization, ensuring its success. There were those then who thought this victim advocacy, I can't say that word, advocacy, this active group would be taking pot shots at law enforcement. Therefore, they didn't want to go get behind it. It was Bob's leadership in the group that gave it instant credibility. As mentioned before, Sergeant Alan Barone indicated the A&M Police Department was also responsible for, as Bob described it, the mundane chore of issuing parking tickets and having student cars towed to impound lots. Ever the diligent lawman, Bob didn't care whose car was in violation, from the newest freshman to the highest dean on the campus. If they were in violation, they were ticketed. The man who hired Bob as director of the campus PD, A&M President Frank Vandiver, made it quite clear that's the way it should be. Bob, I want you to get these parking violators, said the Prez. And Bob said, yes, sir, I will. The Prez said, raise hell with them. And Bob said, yes, sir, I will. And he did. And the Prez was pleased until one of Bob's traffic officers ticketed the Prez's car. Whoa, now, just a minute. If that wasn't bad enough, another officer, with Bob's blessing, ticketed the occupant of the campus's highest ivory tower, and the legend in his own mind, head football coach Jackie Sherrill. Hey now, just a doggone minute. Don't you know who I am? After Sherrill's car was ticketed 3 times, Bob very well knew who he was, and vice versa. And it didn't make any difference to Bob. As he told me, I would have ticketed the car of my sainted mother if she were parking in violation. Bob was not only Mr. FBI and Mr. Law and Order. In my book, he was Mr. Integrity. And I do not use that word lightly. Here's an example of why I tell you that. With that distinct eye patch, we all immediately know it's Bob. But do we all immediately know why he wore that eye patch? It was because of his integrity, his dedication to commitment, to keeping his word. That's how Bob Wiatt lost his left eye. It was a Thursday night in 1987 during his usual exercise routine. He called his eye doctor because the vision in his left eye suddenly became blurred. The doctor told Bob to get over here first thing in the morning. Bob said, sorry, Doc, but I promised some people over in Austin that I'd help them out with a training program tomorrow, and I'm heading over there early. I'll see you Monday. By the time Monday rolled around, Bob could only half see his eye doctor. He had suffered a massive detached retina. His eye doctor had his eye doctor caught it in time on that previous Friday, he perhaps could have saved Bob's eye. 3 subsequent surgeries did save his right eye. But because Bob Wiatt had made a commitment, had kept a promise, was a man of his word, he paid a stiff price for his integrity. Even with the devastation of losing an eye, Ann Wiatt recalled her husband's reaction. You take, Bob said, what life gives you. And that was it, period. As noted, it was Bob's penchant for physical conditioning that led to his tragedy. Bob was, as almost everyone knows, a physical fitness freak. Throughout his law enforcement career, he did sit-ups, push-ups, power lifts, he did rope climbs. You all know how most people do rope climbs from your high school gym class. You know, you reach up, put 2 hands up, and wrap your legs and feet around the rope and go up the rope like an inchworm. Not Bob Wiatt. He did it by only using his hands and arms. But even that wasn't enough of a challenge for Bob Wiatt. He would strap 35-pound weights to his belt and then do his rope climbs like an ape out of a Tarzan movie. Being a physical fitness freak, he was sometimes perturbed about what he called our wimpy society. He was particularly upset with women who baked cakes and used an electric mixer to whip the batter. I'm told recently Ann finally got an electric mixer. Bob Wiatt did not write letters or memos, he wrote epistles. many of them with a puckish-like grin. His monthly department activity reports gave President Vandiver all the joy he needed to replace the agony of his own parking tickets. It is said the Prez looked forward with great anticipation to his receipt of Bob's reports. Is it any wonder when an all too typical monthly report from the university's police department director would read like this? In response to a theft charge on campus, he wrote verbatim, quote, "The complainant portrayed this theft of massive proportions. The stolen item was of significant rarity so that its value could not readily be attributed to a dollar amount." After the officer was able to becalm the complainant, he finally revealed the identity of this stolen property: a 1.75 liter bottle of Cuervo Gold tequila. In response to an illegal parking charge, Bob's office report said, quote, "The officer noticed the robust young man hop into his car parked in a handicapped zone and congratulated him on his disability had apparently been improved. The flustered student then perceived the real reason for the query. He quickly acknowledged that the placard displayed that entitled him to park in the space was actually issued to his mother. She had admonished him to keep it in the vehicle at all times so that when he took her somewhere, she would always have the placard with her. Where is she now? Asked the officer, to which the student replied, home. Where is home? In San Antonio, but she's coming up to see me this weekend. These are word for word typical of Bob's reports. A now retired FBI agent by the name of Sonny Benavides, who was in awe of Bob's writing style, put it this way: to say Bob had a way with words was an understatement. All of us who knew Bob well, Sonny wrote me, he was a stickler for detail in his written correspondence. He had a scurrilous wit and the ability to spear adversaries. At the same time, they were unaware that they were being skewered. It is reported that another of Bob's fellow FBI agents said of Bob, had a gift for flowing and florid use of the language. He was the only member, this agent was the only member of the Bureau that had to have a dictionary by his side when he read Bob's reports. Meanwhile, Mr. Benavides and I talked about Bob's lack of patience with the bureaucracy and how he must have curdled with disdain at some of the FBI's obsession with such. A good example is one memorandum form the Bureau used. In that official form is a section labeled Action Desired in dealing with memos of this type. There are about 30 actions desired, including one that says, prepare tickler and then return with explanation of information of action taken. For those who raised Wiatt's wrath, and there were a few, he could be a bristly Bob, not unlike a prickly pear. A notation to return with explanation or notation as to action taken was sure to raise the hackles on the back of Bob's white-haired head. I don't know if any of you know this, but Bob wanted to write a book about those exploits on the campus. Those exploits and the stories were ones that A&M President Vandiver couldn't wait to read. He said Bob's comments on life on the Aggie campus were funnier than any Blondie and Dagwood comic strip appearing in the Bryan College Station Eagle at the time. However, one final comment should be made about those reports. With Bob Wiatt at the University Police Department's helm, we can see exactly why Texas A&M campus was rated as one of the safest in the academic reporting community, thanks to its director and its penman, poet Bob Wiatt. Bob Wiatt was born on August 10, 1926. He left us last August on Friday the 13th. I'll bet that bit of irony brought a grin to his grisly countenance as he approached the pearly gates. He was 84 years old in 3 days. He earned the nickname Mr. FBI from law enforcement agencies across the state and beyond for his service to Texas and the United States. He was, in fact, a poster boy for the agency in that he forever looked exactly like what a law enforcement agent should look like. After 53 years in law enforcement and upon his retirement from A&M in 2004, he was honored with emeritus status conferred upon him by Texas A&M University's Board of Regents. Bob was active in many nonprofit organizations during his years in Bryan College Station. He was a founding board member of the Brazos Valley Rape Crisis Center, Scotty's House, and the Women's Federal Prison. Capping all of the many honors he received during his career was the one when he was named a Legend of Aggieland in 2000. I've had personal proof of the admiration people feel for Bob Wiatt from people who never even met him. When I mentioned the name Bob Wiatt a couple of months ago to a huge Abilene audience of Wyndham School District teachers, those are the people who teach inside the prisons, murmurs of respect could be heard sweeping across the room. One of the reasons there are so few published stories about Bob Wiatt is that when you Google him, you get jillions of stories about his obituary, but little else. The reason for the lack of stories is that it's FBI policy that no one talks except headquarters. That's the policy. They don't talk about anything. All comments come from FBI in Washington, D.C., or at the least from command headquarters such as Houston. Another reason for the absence of Wiatt stories is, according to District Attorney Bill Turner, there are a lot of people here who know a lot of stories about Bob Wiatt, but they back off with a big grin and say, no, I can't tell that story. As you have graciously heard, I am not one of those people who can't tell that story. On the other hand, at Bob's memorial service, Bill Turner said a lot of kind words about Bob, as did a lot of other people. In so doing, he mentioned how it was only a couple of weeks ago that a lot of us local police officers, county sheriff, Texas Rangers, all got together around an afternoon telling Wiatt stories. How I would have loved to sat in on that session. One of the greatest compliments I ever received as a writer came from Bob Wiatt. When I told him how much I really wanted to write his autobiography, he told me that there was no one that he would want to do it more than he would me. What an honor. But his ensuing back injury in 2006 precluded me from that honor. The greatest compliment became one of my greatest disappointments. Bob Wiatt left us on Friday the 13th last year. I'll bet that irony brought another grin to his face as he approached those pearly gates. In closing this, for me, a labor of love, let me all ask you, and especially you, Ann Wiatt, to ponder with me and wonder, what will poor Bob Wiatt do now that he's up there in heaven with no more bad guys to catch? Thank you kindly.